She discovers her sibling sabotaged her job interview by impersonating her online. The twist: the company knew but hired the sibling anyway to exploit their rivalry. The red meeting in progress icon stared back at me like a mocking eye. My cursor hovered over the join button, but every time I clicked, a cold, clinical pop-up blocked my path. Access denied. User is already logged into this session from another device. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was the final interview for Vanguard Media, the culmination of 5 years of grueling work, missed family dinners, and 2 separate bank accounts drained to pay for certifications. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 10 a.m. According to my screen, I was already in the meeting. I was already speaking to the board of directors. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air settled over my skin as I realized that someone was currently stealing my voice, my face, and my future in real time. The morning had started so differently. I woke up at 6 a.m. in my cramped apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the view of a brick wall, feeling like I was finally on the verge of escape. I had spent the last hour meticulously steaming my only professional blazer and rehearsing my notes on market volatility. For years I had been the reliable one in the family, while my brother Julian spent his 20s drifting from one failed, entrepreneurial scheme to another. Always leaning on our parents' dwindling retirement fund, I was working 12-hour shifts. I remembered the nights I sat at my kitchen table, eyes burning from the glow of a laptop, while Julian's laughter drifted from the living room as he played video games. He always resented my focus, calling me the corporate drone, yet he never hesitated to ask for a loan when his rent was due. This job at Vanguard was supposed to be my clean break. But now the screen was a wall I couldn't climb. I tried refreshing the browser, my breathing becoming shallow and ragged. I checked my phone, thinking perhaps I had accidentally logged in there, but the screen was dark. Then a notification flashed on my laptop's secondary monitor. A system alert from a shared cloud drive Julian and I had used years ago for family photos. It showed a massive spike in data usage coming from an IP address I recognized instantly. It was Julian's apartment. A nauseating wave of clarity washed over me. Julian wasn't just a drifter. He was a tech whiz with a mean streak and a desperate need for a win. I didn't think. I grabbed my car keys and ran out the door, still wearing my blazer and pajama bottoms. The drive across town felt like a blur of red lights and narrow misses. My mind was a chaotic loop of why. Why would he do this? To sabotage me? To prove he could? As I pulled up to his dilapidated brick building, I saw his car in the driveway. I didn't go to the front door. I knew he wouldn't open it. Instead, I crept around the side of the house to the window of his office. A room filled with high-end monitors and tangled wires that our parents had bought him to start his career. I peered through the gap in the blinds and the sight turned my blood to ice. Julian was sitting there wearing a professional headset, his face illuminated by the glow of 3 different screens. On the main monitor I saw the Vanguard Media boardroom. But on his output screen I saw my own face. He was using a sophisticated deepfake overlay that mapped my features onto his movements perfectly. As he spoke into the mic, the software pitch-shifted his voice into mine. But he wasn't trying to get me hired. He was leaning back in his chair, a smug, arrogant smirk on my face, saying things I would never dream of. "Honestly, your current data models are primitive," Julian said, using my voice to insult the very people who held my career in their hands. "I'm probably overqualified to even be talking to you today." He rolled my eyes and sighed with a theatrical boredom that made me want to scream through the glass. He was intentionally burning the bridge I had spent years building. He wanted me to be blacklisted. He wanted to ensure that I stayed exactly where he was, stuck, bitter, and going nowhere. He was performing a caricature of me, a version designed to be hated. Just as I raised my fist to shatter the glass and end the charade, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a call from my mother. I hesitated, my hand shaking against the window pane. I answered, my voice a jagged wreck. "Mom, I can't talk right now, Julian is." "Oh, Clara," she interrupted, her voice brimming with a rare, fragile joy. "Have you heard the news? Julian called me 10 minutes ago. He said he finally landed a huge consulting gig with a media firm. He sounded so happy, so proud of himself. He said he finally figured out how to use his talents. Thank God, Claire. I was so worried about him. This is the fresh start our family needs, isn't it? He said you helped him get his foot in the door." The words felt like a physical weight pinning me to the spot. If I burst in there now, if I exposed the fraud, I wouldn't just be stopping a crime. I would be the one who snatched the miracle away from my mother. She had spent years crying over Julian's failures, her health declining with every debt he accrued. To her, Julian was finally succeeding. If I told her the truth, she would see me as the jealous sister who couldn't handle her brother's sudden rise. Julian had anticipated this. He hadn't just stolen my identity, he had used our mother's heart as a human shield. I stood in the shadows of the alleyway watching my brother finish the interview, with a condescending flick of his wrist. I waited for the inevitable email. I expected a scathing rejection, a notification that I was no longer being considered, or perhaps even a threat of legal action for my unprofessionalism. I walked back to my car, defeated, the blazer feeling like a shroud. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the steering wheel, waiting for the world to collapse. Then my phone chimed. It was an email from Vanguard Media. I closed my eyes, bracing for the blow, and tapped it open. "Dear Claire," it began. "We were deeply intrigued by your unconventional approach during today's session. Your confidence, while aggressive, is exactly the kind of disruptive energy we are looking for at Vanguard. We believe you will be a perfect fit for our high-pressure environment. Attached is your formal offer for the senior analyst position. We look forward to seeing you in the office on Monday." I stared at the screen until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. Julian hadn't ruined the interview. In some sick, twisted irony, his arrogance, his performative, malicious version of me, had actually won them over. He hadn't just sabotaged my reputation. He had accidentally secured the job. But he wasn't going to tell them he was an imposter. I realized with a jolt of horror that he intended to show up on Monday. He intended to walk into that building and live the life I had earned. I was left standing in the wreckage of my own dream, holding a golden ticket that had my name on it but my brother's fingerprints all over it. The game hadn't ended. It had just taken a turn into a nightmare I never saw coming. The lobby of Vanguard Media was a cathedral of glass and brushed steel, designed to make anyone entering feel small, replaceable, and entirely exposed. I stood at the security desk, my fingers white-knuckled around the strap of my laptop bag. I wasn't here to check in for my first day. I was here to set the building on fire, metaphorically speaking. The air conditioning was set to a bone-chilling temperature, and the silent, sleek elevators hummed with an efficiency that felt predatory. When the receptionist asked for my name, the word caught in my throat. I couldn't say Clara, because according to the glowing digital directory behind her, Clara was already upstairs in Suite 402. I took a visitor's badge instead, the plastic clipping onto my blazer like a badge of shame. Walking through the fourth-floor corridor felt like navigating a fever dream. The carpets muffled my footsteps as I passed rows of open-concept desks where young, hungry-looking analysts hovered over glowing monitors. Then I saw it. The corner office I had envisioned in my dreams for months. Through the clear glass wall, I saw my own name etched into a frosted acrylic nameplate. Clara Vance, Senior Analyst. But sitting in the ergonomic chair, his feet propped up on the mahogany desk I had earned, was Julian. He was wearing a suit I recognized, one he'd bought with the emergency money I gave him for a car repair 6 months ago. He was laughing into a desk phone, twirling a high-end fountain pen between his fingers with a casual arrogance that made the air in my lungs turn to ash. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine through the glass, and he didn't even flinch. He just gave me a small, mocking wave. I didn't go to HR. I went straight for the heavy double doors at the end of the hall marked Marcus Thorne suit. I pushed past a startled assistant and burst into a room that smelled of expensive leather and old money. Marcus Thorne was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. He was a man whose reputation for being a disruptor was legendary and feared. He turned slowly, his eyes sharp and unreadable. I didn't wait for him to speak. I slammed my passport and my original university transcripts onto his desk. "The man in that office is Julian Vance," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and exhaustion. "He used deepfake technology to steal my identity during the interview. He's a fraud. I am the person you actually hired." I expected an immediate call to security. I expected shock, perhaps even an apology. Instead, Thorne leaned back against his desk and let out a soft, dry chuckle. He didn't even glance at my passport. He looked at me with a strange, predatory smile that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I know," he said simply. The two words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. He walked toward me, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Do you really think a firm like Vanguard wouldn't catch a digital overlay in a high-stakes interview? Our security protocols are decades ahead of whatever amateur software your brother was using. He paused, his gaze raking over me. We knew it wasn't you, Clara. But we hired him anyway. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Why? I whispered, the word feeling like a plea. Thorne's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because your brother showed us something your resume didn't. He showed us a lack of conscience. He showed us that he was willing to dismantle his own flesh and blood to get ahead. That kind of ruthlessness is a rare commodity. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial silkiness. And I knew that the moment you found out, you'd come charging in here like a wounded lion. I wanted to see what you would do. I wanted to see if you had that same fire, or if you were just another girl with a high GPA. Before I could respond, a junior staffer scurried in to drop off a file, leaning toward me for a split second as Thorne took a phone call. Careful, the staffer breathed, his voice barely audible. Thorne loves blood in the water. This isn't a company, it's a gladiatorial pit. He calls it radical competition. He's done this before, pitting partners against each other to see who survives. The staffer vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving me with the sickening realization that I wasn't a victim of a crime. I was a test subject in a corporate experiment. Thorne wanted us to destroy each other for the sport of it. Thorne hung up the phone and looked at me expectantly. Here is the deal, Clara. I won't fire Julian. But I'll bring you on as a special consultant. You'll work in the shadows helping him maintain the facade. If the project succeeds, maybe I'll decide which one of you is actually worth the title. If you refuse, I'll blacklist you both for fraud. Your choice. I looked out the glass wall at Julian, who was now shamelessly flirting with a colleague. I thought of my mother's hopeful voice on the phone. I thought of my empty bank account. I realized I was trapped in a cage with a wolf, and the only way out was to become one. The following week was a descent into a private purgatory. I was relegated to a windowless workroom in the basement, tasked with ghostwriting the very reports Julian was presenting to the board. Every night my phone would buzz with a message from him. Hey sis, the data on the Q3 forecast looks like gibberish. Fix it by 8 a.m. or we both look like idiots. I spent my nights fixing his sloppy math and correcting his fundamental misunderstandings of market trends. It was a bitter, soul-crushing irony. I was doing the work of my dream job, but I was doing it as a slave to my brother's ego. I watched him on the internal office feed taking credit for my insights, his chest puffed out as he basked in the unearned praise of our colleagues. The domestic tension at home became unbearable. My mother would call me, gushing about how Julian had finally found his stride, and how she was so glad I was there to support him in his new role. I had to bite my tongue until it bled, unable to tell her that her favorite son was a parasite feeding on my life's work. Julian started coming home late, smelling of expensive scotch, bragging about his office and his future, all while I sat at the kitchen table with dark circles under my eyes, preparing his notes for the next morning. He started to believe his own lie, treating me like a subordinate instead of a sister. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday during a high-stakes board meeting regarding the Aegis project, a complex algorithm I had spent 2 years developing. I was permitted to sit in the back of the room as a technical assistant. Julian stood at the head of the long glass table, my slides projected behind him. He started explaining the algorithm, but within minutes he began to flounder, mixing up the variables and making wild, unsubstantiated claims. A board member interrupted with a sharp technical question and Julian froze. I saw the beads of sweat on his forehead. Then he turned and pointed at me with a smug, condescending grin. My assistant here handles the clerical side, but as I design the core logic I can tell you. He then proceeded to spout a blatant lie about the code's functionality, looking at me as if daring me to correct him in front of the lions. As I sat there watching the board members nod, oblivious to the fact that Julian's logic would eventually crash the entire system, I felt something in me finally die. It was the part of me that cared about the family name, the part that wanted my mother's approval, and the part that played by the rules. I looked at Thorne, who was watching me with a look of intense, amused curiosity. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the killer instinct. I didn't say a word. I just leaned back and let a cold, dark mask settle over my face. I didn't want my job back anymore. I wanted Julian to lose everything. I wanted Thorne to watch his precious experiment turn into a scorched earth disaster. The rivalry wasn't about a paycheck anymore. It was about total, absolute retribution. The hum of the basement servers was the only company I had as I began to rewrite the DNA of the Aegis project. In the quiet, blue-lit hours after midnight, I wasn't just fixing Julian's mistakes anymore. I was building a maze. I moved through the lines of code with a surgeon's precision, planting subtle, recursive loops that appeared perfectly functional on the surface but were designed to trigger a cascading failure under heavy load. I called it my ticking clock. It was a delicate trap. If Julian had even a basic understanding of back-end architecture, he might have noticed the discrepancies. But he was too busy enjoying the view from the fourth floor, too occupied with his new title to realize that the ground beneath him was becoming hollow. Every keystroke felt like a declaration of independence. I wasn't just a consultant or a shadow. I was the architect of my own justice, crafting a scenario where the only way to save the company would be to admit that the person they had publicly championed was utterly incompetent. The psychological toll reached its peak during a Friday dinner at our parents' house. The table was set with the good china, a celebration for Julian's stellar first month. I sat there picking at my food, while Julian regaled our father with stories of how he was mentoring me. "It's a lot of pressure, Dad," Julian said, leaning back with a glass of wine, "but I'm happy to carry Clara for a while. She's good with the small stuff but she lacks the vision for the big picture. I have to keep a close eye on her work to make sure it meets the Vanguard standard." I looked at my mother, expecting her to see the absurdity, but she simply beamed at him, reaching out to pat his hand. "We're just so glad you're looking out for your sister, Julian. It's what family does." The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. In that moment, the last thread of my guilt snapped. They weren't just proud of him. They had accepted a version of reality where I was his subordinate, a secondary character in the Julian Vance success story. If I didn't act, this lie would become my permanent identity. I realized then that to save myself, I had to let the perfect family image burn to the ground. The day of the collapse arrived with a deceptive stillness. Vanguard was in the final stages of a multi-billion-dollar merger, and the entire board of directors was gathered in the war room to watch the Aegis platform go live for the new partners. I stood in the corner, a ghost in a sharp suit, watching as the screens began to flicker. At first it was just a minor delay, a few milliseconds of lag. Then the first red warning flashed. Critical memory leak detected. Julian, standing at the head of the room, laughed it off. "Just a minor sync issue, gentlemen. We'll have it cleared in a second." He tapped frantically at his keyboard, but because he didn't understand the logic of the code I had written, every command he entered only accelerated the failure. The room descended into chaos. The lag turned into a total freeze, and then the screens went black, replaced by a single pulsing error message that only I knew how to bypass. The potential partners began to stand up, their faces etched with fury and doubt. This wasn't just a glitch. It was a public execution of the company's reliability. Julian's bravado vanished in an instant. His face went a sickly shade of gray, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his mouse. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, silent plea for help. He wanted me to step in and play the reliable assistant one more time. He wanted me to fix it so he could go back to pretending he was the genius. I didn't move. I simply leaned against the wall and watched as he stammered, lied, and eventually fell into a panicked silence that exposed his fraud more clearly than any confession could have. In the middle of the shouting, Marcus Thorne looked away from the monitors and locked eyes with me. He didn't look angry, he looked fascinated. He saw the stillness in me, the lack of panic, and he finally understood the killer instinct he had been looking for. He signaled his assistant to clear the room, and within minutes, it was just the three of us. Thorne, a broken Julian, and me. The silence was deafening. Julian tried to speak. "Clara, you have to. The code, it's doing something weird." "Shut up, Julian," I said, my voice cold and level. I turned to Thorne. "The system is locked. It's encrypted with a key that changes every 60 seconds based on a private sequence I created. Julian can't fix it. Your entire IT department can't fix it in time to save this merger. You have 10 minutes before the partners walk out of the building and the deal is dead." Thorne crossed his arms, a small, dark smile playing on his lips. And what are your terms, Clara? First, I said, pointing at Julian, he's done. I want him escorted out by security, and I want a formal letter in his file detailing his impersonation. Second, I want the Director of Analytics position, effective immediately, with a salary that reflects the fact that I've been doing two people's jobs for a month. Third, I want a signed settlement for the emotional and professional damages caused by your radical competition experiment. If you agree, I'll have the system back online in 30 seconds. If you don't, I walk out that door and you can explain to your shareholders why a billion-dollar merger failed because you hired a deepfake artist. Thorne looked at Julian, who was trembling, then back at me. He saw the wolf I had become. You're more like me than I thought, he remarked, reaching for a pen and a pad of company letterhead. Fine. You have your deal. Fix the system. I walked to the head of the table, shoved Julian's laptop aside, and entered the override sequence. The screens flared back to life instantly, the data flowing perfectly. I didn't look at Julian as Thorne called security. I didn't watch as they took him by the arms and led him out of the room he had stolen. I just watched the numbers on the screen, feeling a cold, hard peace settle over me. The office was quiet an hour later when I finally sat down in the director's chair. The sleek, ergonomic seat felt different now. Not like a dream but like a territory I had fought for and won. My phone was blowing up with frantic, angry messages from my parents, but I didn't answer. I knew the fallout would be long and painful. The family was fractured, perhaps beyond repair, and my reputation in the small world of our relatives was likely ruined. But as I looked at my own name on the digital dashboard, I realized I didn't care. I had spent my whole life being the nice girl, who finished second so others could feel first. That girl was gone. I had survived the wolves by learning how to bite, and for the first time in my life I wasn't just Clara Vance, I was the one in control. I leaned back, watched the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and finally I breathed.